Thank you, Nikos. We heard, the very first thing we heard at the beginning of this symposium was that at the moment, exactly 130 years ago today, when Kazantzakis was born, his father thought he was going to become a priest. Of Despotis, indeed, a bishop. And His Eminence, to His Eminence, we owe, I think, the marvellous insight that actually, 130 years on, in a way, he did. And I'm very grateful for that insight. I would like to think more about it. But I'm afraid the aspect of Kazantzakis that I'm going to talk about today has rather little to do with the church, or indeed with Kazantzakis' always troubled relationship to divinity and mortality and God. I'm going to talk about more earthly things, and specifically the novel Viosque Politia to Alexis Zorba, known in English by the slightly misleading title of Zorba the Greek. And I want really to interrogate the Greekness of Kazantzakis' fictional character Zorbas. Now, the action of Kazantzakis' most famous novel is set at the end of the First World War. The writing of the novel took place during the Second World War, just over 20 years later. It was written between 1941 and 1943 under the conditions of the Axis occupation of Greece. The hero of the novel, as I'm sure most of you here know, Alexis Zorbas, is called in the novel, is loosely based on a real workman called Yorgos Zorbas, with whom Kazantzakis in 1916, just like the narrator in the story, had opened a lignite mine. The story is told in the first person by the unnamed boss, Nikos, who both is and is not Kazantzakis himself. The boss is the absolute antithesis of Zorba. Where Zorba is physical and exuberant, the boss is a writer obsessed with books and abstract ideas. When he first meets Zorba in Piraeus on the way to Crete, the narrator is reading Dante, the Divine Comedy. When a stranger enters the harbour cafe and abruptly engages him in conversation, the boss quickly realises, I quote from the English translation, the only one that so far exists in print despite its many shortcomings. Zorba was the man I had sought so long in vain, a living heart, a large, voracious, a great brute soul, not yet severed from Mother Earth. This is the beginning of an adventure, which is also a philosophical dialogue and a process of almost religious initiation. The boss agrees to employ Zorba as his foreman in the lignite mine he is about to open in Crete. This is to be his way of escaping, as he puts it, from the prison house of books and abstractions and entering the real world. But this boss is actually incorrigible. He's never going to enter the real world. And I think it's a great mistake to read him actually as Kazantzakis himself. But the lignite mine soon turns out to be not much more than a pretext. Through a loosely connected series of episodes involving a variety of minor characters, the boss and Zorba confront one another's assumptions and ways of life. Vital catalysts in this process are the two women characters. Kazantzakis is notorious for his portrayal of female roles. One of these prominent women in the novel is a retired French prostitute, Madame Hortense by name, and with her, Zorba soon embarks on a casual but rumbustious fling. The other is a beautiful young widow, the temptress of the village. The boss is tormented by feelings of lust. It takes the scornful urgings of Zorba, as much as the widow's own charms, to persuade the narrator to spend the night with her, but tragedy immediately follows. For an unrelated reason, the villagers turn on the sexual temptress in their midst, and while the boss watches helplessly, and despite a forceful intervention on her behalf by Zorba, the beautiful woman is violently killed before his eyes. It's hard to avoid thinking that Kazantzakis has here rather callously removed from his story an element of the plot that might, in the hands of another writer, have been allowed to assume far greater importance. Women in Kazantzakis novels are usually treated like this. Catalysts who affect the development of the male characters, but their work once done, are then treated as expendable commodities. In Zorba, both Madame Hortense and the widow die, and there is some cruelty in the literary representation of both those deaths. In all Kazantzakis novels, women die violently, especially if they are sexually alluring. There's no work by Kazantzakis in which a woman is a central character. Zorba, as everybody knows, is portrayed as much larger than life. He's aged about 60, and that is not far from Kazantzakis' own age when he began writing his novels. He comes, we tend to think of him as a Cretan, but actually he comes from Macedonia. Zorba has done almost everything in his country's history in his life. He's taken part in the violent struggles of Macedonia at the beginning of the century. He was once a married man, but lost both wife and child. Since then, he's been constantly rootless on the move. The earthy physicality of his world contrasts directly with the spiritual and abstract problems which trouble the boss. Zorba rejects all abstract beliefs out of hand. It expresses himself directly through the body and the senses. Except that actually, an awful lot of the book is taken up with Zorba talking about, guess what, abstract issues. But the way he likes to express himself, as we're told, is through the emotions, and particularly through dance. That's a scene, of course, made famous by Anthony Quinn in the film. Zorba's philosophy of life is summed up at an early point in the novel like this: I don't believe in anything or anyone, only in Zorba. Not because Zorba is better than the others, not at all, not a little bit. He's a brute like the rest. But I believe in Zorba because he's the only being I have in my power, the only one I know. All the rest are ghosts. I see with these eyes, I hear with these ears, I digest with these guts. All the rest are ghosts, I tell you. When I die, everything will die. The whole Zorbatic world will go to the bottom. But this can't be the whole story. Because in the end, it takes Zorba's opposite, the boss, with his education, with his despised pen and ink, to immortalize Zorba and turn that Zorbatic world, long after Zorba actually has died, into something that outlasts him and that we're reading more than half a century later. The boss sees in Zorba's big-hearted spontaneity an idealized version of Rousseau's natural man. I quote again, this is the boss musing to himself. The universe for Zorba, as for the first men on earth, was a weighty, intense vision. The stars glided over him, the sea broke against his temples. He lived the earth, the water, the animals, and God, without the distorting intervention of reason. So, if you like, the whole novel is a dialogue between nature and reason. And a little later, when Zorba has spent all the boss's money on wine, women, and song, and the illiterate Zorba puts pen to paper right in the middle of the novel and writes a long letter to apologize and explain himself. And the boss, reading this ink-blocked letter, thinks this: I do not know whether to be angry or laugh or just admire this primitive man who simply cracked life's shell, logic, morality, honesty, and went straight to its very substance. At the heart of the novel, as many readers have recognised, lies a theme dear to its author, that of freedom. At the end of their first meeting on the harbour side of Piraeus, Zorba insists that when it comes to playing music, you must realise I'm a man. Forget that, that's the English translation. What Zorba says is ime anthropos. I'm a human being. In 1951, you could get away with that. You couldn't today. Anthropos, human being. And understandably, the boss asks, a human being, anthropos? What do you mean? Only Kazantzakis could ask a question like that, sure. Well, free. Now, left out. Replies Zorba triumphantly. In the Zorbatic world, to be human is to be free. When these words were written in 1941 in Aegina, during the famine of the first winter after Greece had been invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Germany's ally Bulgaria, it took some faith and some courage to believe this, that to be human is to be free. The action of the novel, as I said at the beginning, is set 20 years before that. So, of course, these events The backdrop against which it was written has no overt presence in the main story. But in his prologue and at the end of the novel, again suppressed in the English translation, Kazantzakis actually does briefly refer to the circumstances in which the novel is being written. But it's surely these later events, the Second World War, when it's being written, that Kazantzakis had in mind later in the novel, when he makes Zorba write to the boss in his letter. This is Zorbas speaking, actually literally writing now. I don't rejoice over the good, and don't despair over the bad. If I hear that the Greeks have taken Constantinople, it's just the same to me as if the Turks were taking Athens. Well, this is supposed to be happening at the time when the Megali there was still alive. It's written at a time, however, when not only is the Megali there dead, but not the Turks, but the Germans and Italians have taken Athens. So victory, defeat. And Zorba's solution is amazing. It's all the same, because to be human is to be free. Zorba expresses his view of victory and defeat in war in terms of the time when the story is supposed to be taking place. But no reader, when the book was first published in 1946, could fail to think of how recently Athens had indeed been taken, not by the traditional enemy Turks, but by the Axis. Zorba is able to rise above even the humiliation and physical privation of such a defeat, and in this way, the novel becomes an affirmation of an innate quality of inner freedom in man, and in Kazantzakis' fellow Greeks in particular. Well, how in the world of the novel does a man like Zorba, born free, so we're told, and uncomplicatedly living free in the present, no matter what happens to him, how does he achieve this remarkable inner freedom? The climax of the novel comes when all the village assembles to watch the inauguration of the cableway. Did I do that? The inauguration of the cableway that Zorba has devised so as to bring down logs from the mountain above the mine to be used as pit shafts. After a build-up of suspense, the first logs are launched down the hillside, and the whole contraption spectacularly collapses. This is the end of the boss's investment in the mine, the end of the whole project that had brought him to Crete, and indeed had brought him together with Zorba. It is a fiasco. But Zorba's reaction to the failure of all their hopes is this the equivalent of the Enaeri falling down? It will not be a fiasco. But as Zorba and the boss contemplate the wreckage of their practical aspirations, both end up sitting down on the ground at the edge of the sea, laughing like wild things, and even the boss finds himself learning to dance like Zorba. Next morning, coming to his senses and reflecting on these events, the boss thinks about what's happened, and he finds his own way, in the language of the philosopher, to translate Zorba's instinctive concept of freedom into words. And this is what he says. It was precisely at that moment that I felt an unexpected sense of deliverance. The Greek word is litrosi, a word with, of course, religious overtones. Litrosi. As if, in the hard, somber labyrinth of necessity, I had discovered liberty herself playing happily in a corner, and I played with her. When everything goes wrong, what a joy to test your soul and see if it has endurance and courage. An invisible and all-powerful enemy, some call him God, others the devil, seems to rush upon us to destroy us, but we are not destroyed. Each time, this is still the boss speaking, each time that within ourselves we are the conquerors, although externally utterly defeated, we human beings feel an indescribable pride and joy. Outward calamity is transformed into a supreme and unshakable felicity. This is what the boss has learned finally from Zorba. And although, of course, it is a universal application, it's surely also very specifically grounded in Kazantzakis' own experience of those first months of occupation in 1941 and 1942, the inner courage and fortitude that he projected through the fictional character of Zorba, these were the resources that he saw and celebrated in the Greeks around him. Diese Männer nächste Antwort, nein, left. Finally, and to conclude, or just before I conclude, the book itself draws quietly but firmly on much older and fundamental aspects of Greek tradition, on ways that Greeks in very different and remote historical periods have confronted the world and written about it. The tale of the workman Zorba, the narrator tells us in the preface, omitted from the English translation, is meant to be a kind of saint's life in the popular tradition, synaxaria or synaxaria. Such tales traditionally have titles in the form Life and Times of, or Life and Opinions of, you might say in English. Vios και Βοηθεία του Τάδε. This is actually the title that Zorba the Greek, this is of course the title that Zorba the Greek was published with, Vios και Βοηθεία του Alexis Zorba. But Kazantzakis' his original working title for the book was actually To Synaxaria to Alexis Zorba. It was going to be the religious chapbook or saint's life of Zorba. And such a book as Synaxaria was an exemplar, traditionally, of the good life. At the same time, it represented an important strand of popular traditional narrative in the Greek-speaking world, right through the Byzantine period and after. To present his novel through its title and some elements of form as a modern Synaxaria is at once to claim the status of a modern secular saint for its hero Zorbas, and at the same time to claim, for this purpose, a Greek narrative tradition much older than that of the modern novel. It's inserted into the much older Byzantine Christian tradition of the popular saint's life. But this is not all. The opening words of the novel have just become famous. I first met him in Piraeus. Don Prokopnois στον Πειραιά. Είχε κατεβεί στο λιμάνι. I'd gone down to the harbour. Now, this is a close, very close, cannot be accidental. This is a very close echo of the famous opening sentence of Plato's dialogue about the ideal state, known in English as Republic, but its real title, the Greek, of course, as you know, is Politia. Viewers get Politia to Alexis Zorba. Plato's Politia begins Katerin Chthes es Piraea. It's almost exactly the same words. Once you spot this resemblance, you see why Kazantzakis dropped the title Synaxaria to Zorba in favour of another title which kept the saint's life formula, Vios και Politia, but now included this word Politia, that is the title of Plato's Republic. Plato had introduced his philosophical dialogue, as he often did, with a realistic narrative taken from daily life. And in precisely the same way, Kazantzakis echoes Plato's words in order to introduce a narrative, that is the whole novel, which is also intended in the modern equivalent of the Platonic dialogue. So, thus warned, we shouldn't be too surprised at the interminable discussion of ultimate things between Zorba and the boss who tells the story. The novel is, as well as a modern saint's life, also a modernist literary equivalent of the Platonic dialogue. It deals with exactly the same fundamental themes of human existence. And just like many of those dialogues of Plato, it ends without either side conclusively winning the argument. In this way, the life and times of Alexis Zorbas, as I prefer to call the novel, in the life and times, Kazantzakis succeeds in weaving together elements of the literary, philosophical, religious, and popular traditions of the Greek language, all the way from ancient times through Byzantine to modern. So, finally, to conclude, Zorba may not be especially or authentically Greek as a fictional character, but his idiosyncratic doctrine of freedom, taught by example, and turned into an enduring work of literature by Kazantzakis' bookish narrator, another fictional character, this doctrine of freedom becomes a modern reworking at once of a traditional Greek saint's life and of Plato's great work of philosophy, the Republic. So the Greek tradition of my title is present and affirmed in Zorbas, the novel, not so much in the character of the protagonist, as in the very telling of the story. So that's a nice stop.